Morning.
Hello. Morning.
Hello.
Afternoon, evening, whichever.
Wherever you're watching, it's good to welcome back Reverend Neary. She's refreshed from her swimming early in the sea or whatever she's been doing. Have you been swimming today, Joe? Be a bit
No.
early.
No,
Yeah.
I had a lie-in.
Good, well done. Well done.
Decided not to get up stupidly early today.
Very well done. You
All good.
deserved
Thank you.
the week you've had. You deserved it. There we
I
are.
should quantify a lie-in is 7:15.
Yep, that
In
would be
case anyone thinks I'm, snoozing on the job and lying until 10 in the morning.
just got up just for this. Yeah.
Yes. No.
There we are. Well, no, there we are. 7:15 would be a lie-in for me, but the dog doesn't allow it, so it has to be done early. What about you, Chris? What would constitute a lie-in for you?
7 o'clock.
Yeah, you see, we're all early risers then, aren't we?
There's no choice. The Lord calls. Yeah, when I talked to some very elderly colleagues, they were expected to be at morning prayer at 6:30 before they did mass.
6:30.
6:30, yeah.
Deary me.
You speak to David Sherlock, 6:30 morning prayer followed by mass at 7.
Gosh.
We don't know how good.
Mid-morning nap at 9.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, he's a good napper. He's our esteemed colleague, David, who believes in the power of a power nap.
21 minutes and 20 seconds. It's timed. Because it's an important, it's something, but he works for him. He's got to 91 nearly, so we're not going to knock it, are we? Having a nap is good for you in the afternoon, I'm told by David. But there we are. And he's up even earlier than us. Because when he brings my paper, just gone 7, he's still already said morning prayer usually. That's because he's used to saying it at 6:30, you see.
Yeah.
Well, it's all about discipline, isn't it? We're about to enter into the Lenten discipline, so perhaps we should start saying morning prayer at 6:30.
As the famous Gregory Page Turner, who has a commonality with both of us, Chris Beaminster and yourself, of course, as he once said to me when I suggested we use one of the shorter psalms on option, because I think it was Psalm 70 something, which has 40 odd verses. He said, "No, David, it's discipline." I felt ashamed. But,
well, we should congratulate those for whom their discipline is Rev Chat. Yeah. Enduring our waffle every week. Well done. Thank you.
Oh,
good and faithful watcher and listener.
So we've got to do 40 verses of Rev Chat today.
Yes, 40. Ready for Lent.
Well, we are only third Sunday before Lent.
We are. But it's little season, as I said to the children in school this week, tiny little bit of green before we get to purple.
Yeah, I was fetched up short yesterday, Chris, by the theological understanding of Reverend Neary when she corrected me for having the crib still out in Beaminster, but having a green cover over the chalice ready for midweek communion.
I said you can have either or. You can't have both.
I did feel suitably chastised in front of the retired Archdeacon of Canterbury.
All I can say is get back to Cudston and redo your training.
I'm going to have to. I'm going to book
green and the crib.
What's
going to happen?
I'm going to book in, David, Chris, immediately to undergo a further update on use of colours. I think I missed the use of colours in liturgy day, so it was.
Turns out it matters more to me than I thought.
Suitably chastised, I skunked out to go to a meeting with the Archdeacon on Zoom.
Sorry, Chris, you're going to say something.
And did you confess your failure to follow correct altar colours to the Archdeacon?
No, he watched me remove it off the top of the altar, so he knew. No confession was required.
What was refreshing is that the Archdeacon of Canterbury was a Lincoln Theological College man, for all his sins, really. But he wasn't particularly bothered whether he had a coloured thing or not, so it didn't bother him.
Only me who was worried.
Reverend Neary, suitably chastised me, and I felt disgraced for suggesting or even doing such a thing, in my high exalted position,
You'd know better.
So there we are. Anyway, shall we have a pause?
Let's do that. So we're in Matthew's Gospel.
One of us is going to read. You want me to read?
Come on then, from your big amplified Bible.
And annotated.
Oh.
Annotated.
Look at that.
13 to 20, isn't it? You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and gives it light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Wow.
That's thrown you all into silence, hasn't it?
I was just shocked. It amazes me how you can read a passage year after year after year and get hit by something that you'd never noticed before. And that reading there hit me. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, Jesus spent quite a bit of time criticizing the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And here it says, unless your righteousness exceeds the Pharisees.
Mm.
So there's a compliment for them.
Oh, you see, I see it the other way around. Their righteousness is very low. But they thought they were right. They were made right by the law, didn't they? But I think Jesus is hinting at something else.
Which means that our righteousness is even lower.
No, it's higher.
No, we've got to exceed it. So he's telling us, at this moment, you're not good enough. Get it up there.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. So we've got to be better than the Pharisees. But then how good did he think the Pharisees were?
Well, that's a good question.
Is it a low bar or a high bar we've got to get over?
It doesn't matter, because the lower it is, the worst condition we're in before we start.
Well, it starts off by whoever breaks the least of the commandments. And one little jot of the commandment. So surely this whole passage is Jesus setting a very high bar. So I would have thought there he's highlighting the Pharisees as having a high bar.
Which is the least of the commandments, though?
Well, that's a good question.
That's a very good question, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. That's why I posed it, because,
coveting your neighbour's ass.
Could well be.
I do. I don't know whether you read the commandments often from the Book of Common Prayer in the Eucharist service. I do during Lent and Advent, but I always do because we use the slightly illegal 1928 prayer book. There's a bit where you just read the beginning of the commandment, but you don't have to read the sort of excessive explanation.
That's right.
Because once you get into the prayer book versions of the commandments, there's some interesting things that go on. Mm.
Right, well, I'll just share with you out of this book, which I've had for donkey's years, called Word of Promise. It's a commentary on Year 8, so I must have had it since Year 8 started. And it says, how does the church today match up to this joint vision of Isaiah and Jesus? Because we looked at the Isaiah passage yesterday at Tuesday at our prayer, and Jesus was telling, God was telling them all off for being way below the expected, practice. So it tells us here, this will involve, says Jesus, a righteousness greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees. We just worked that out for ourselves a little bit. Nice to know we're on the same track as the writers of this book. These were admired by all for their devotion, learning, and strict obedience to all the requirements of the law. I think we've got a lot to go for before we start here. Having to be more righteous than the Pharisees would have seemed impossible to all of Jesus' hearers, including his disciples. In what way could their righteousness be surpassed? And Jesus gives the answer when he calls his disciples salt of the earth and light of the world. Why? Because the Pharisees restricted their sphere of righteousness to the chosen people of Israel. They cared for the poor, certainly, but only the poor of their own people. Jesus expects more, an undiscriminating love which reaches out to all in need, regardless of race or religious qualifications. I would add in sexuality. This kind of love is what God's law is all about, fulfilled now by Jesus.
And it's about faith making us right. So the whole point about Jesus coming to fulfill the law is it's saying that the law is no longer the thing that makes you right with God. It's your faith. It's your relationship. It's your forgiveness. It's your grace. And but it doesn't mean you can ignore the law. It means that becomes your foundation. But it's actually about being made right because of the way you live your life, I think, which I guess it connects into the salt and light. And it widens the brief rather than narrows it. Because that's what the Pharisees got caught in a trap, really, didn't they? They became so focused on the observance of the law and the correct observance of the law that made them right with God, that they kind of missed the point, that this was about a faith that renews life and brings abundance and transforms the world. And so Jesus is reminding us that salt and light, which are those metaphors about transforming things much bigger than a tiny bit of salt can change the whole flavour of a dish, and a small amount of light can illuminate an enormous space. And that actually the things we do have a much bigger impact than just observing letters of law.
Also, if you look at Jesus' other teaching here, this is a passage about not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law. And yet, what do we read at every communion service? Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second commandment is this: love thy neighbour as thyself. There is no
These are the greatest commandments.
These are the greatest commandments. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So realistically, is what Jesus says there, the stroke and letter of the law is those two commandments. And all the other commandments is what human beings have written to try and work out how to fulfill them.
Yeah, maybe. But then, sorry.
Go on, Caitlin, Joe.
Well, no, and going back to David's, if we're on, it doesn't matter whether the Pharisees are setting a high or a low bar, we've got to exceed it. So for wherever we start from, we're doing worse to start off with. But, that actually living those commandments, living those two commandments that you've said about loving God and loving our neighbour as ourselves is lifelong daily work, and most of us fail every day. And sometimes it is good to remind ourselves, have mercy upon me, a miserable offender. As in, I'm far from perfect. There's lots of work to be done in me. So
there's a risk here of, like you say, if we get too worried about obeying all these rules and religiosities and things, that we just beat ourselves up and it gets depressing.
Well, it's also nonsense, I think, because we get distracted from what the purpose is.
Also, we have the joy of being forgiven.
But then surely the joy of being forgiven is also remembering that we've got to do better.
At least make an effort.
Well, try harder.
Try harder.
Try.
The reason the Isaiah passage for this week from Isaiah 58, 1-12 has been included, I think, is because it's the two are roughly the same message. Isaiah is saying to his readers, I think, that actually all your practices and religious things are pointless, because what you're expecting is God is what God is expecting is that we see the world through his eyes, where we want him to see them through our eyes. And all the play acting we get up to is pointless if we're not centered on God. And that, in a way, is what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, isn't it? Salt is important because we're all part of improving God's world. And I didn't realise until I got my annotated Bible out that the reference to the lamp is a reference about David and his people Israel leading forward. We refer to light that leads us on, but to the people before us, it was referring to the leadership of King David and leading the people of Israel forward into the new promised life that was to come.
Which would make sense because it's Matthew's gospel, which has lots of allusions back in, well, not allusions, drawings back into the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
The thing, I mean, when we very first heard that, moving it forward from sort of personal holiness, when you first read that reading, so much of the discussion of meetings and conversations this week has been about, all kinds of normal stuff that we spend a lot of time talking about in the church, being growth of our parishes, the fragility of our parishes, financial security, the church commissioners. We've had lots of debate in lots of different contexts in PCC and things about whether we should be, the church commissioners should be giving money away and where that money comes from, and parish share and how we afford our posts and keeping the show on the road. I've had oodles of conversations about that this week. And I just was so struck when I heard you read, David, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? And I just thought, as church, as people of faith, are we still salty enough? Are we doing what church should do? Or have we got completely distracted not by the law exactly, but by the traditions and the institution and keeping the show on the road? And we're in danger of becoming irrelevant, because people think we're daft or stupid and can't do anything and they've got nothing to offer. But actually what we've got to offer is salt and light. And, and there's an item on the radio this week about how, in the light of the Hillsborough report and other reports, the figures are calling for candour in public life, for people to tell the truth. And I think, gosh, the church should be leading, saying, we should be truth tellers. We shouldn't hide away our mistakes. We shouldn't lie about things. We should be people of truth and light and salt.
Well, I'll tell you what, Jane Williams, I read a lot of Jane Williams' commentary to get inspiration. The inspiration doesn't come from me alone. You'll be surprised to know. She writes about salt and light, or salt particularly. That's why Jesus says to his disciples, that his disciples are to be the salt of the earth and light of the world. Their faith is not just or even primarily about themselves, but about their participation in God's work in the world. This is the fulfillment of the law according to Jesus. And you talked about the fulfillment of the law being those two commandments, Chris. The law is essentially a corporate thing. It is designed to build a people whose life together reflects the nature of God, and so makes it more credible to others.
Well, that almost sounds like somebody who's clever enough to be married to an ex-Archbishop of Canterbury.
Or an Archbishop of Canterbury is clever enough to be married to someone who can explain it properly to him.
Thank you. Let's not diminish her own integrity by who she's married to.
Exactly.
But yes.
It wasn't by any means, Joe.
No, just be careful. But anyway.
Don't set her off again. She's already got something to trouble us this week.
I have been a very, very robust week this week. But yes. No, I think you're right. I think it is about how we behave together.
It is.
As well as how we behave personally. But the corporate nature of who we are and what we've got to say to the world is so important.
Haven't we almost lost that? Because we're so individual. And that's the way our society's gone in the last 20, 30 years.
I would say even more so since lockdown and COVID, Chris.
Yeah.
You know, because we've become individuals and looking after ourselves, and
it's really complex. I mean, it's really complex because, I can talk about how I want the church, and I mean the people, the institution, the public voice to be, something of worth, to be salt and light. But then it's very difficult, and I completely wholeheartedly believe that and want that to be true. But then, for example, one of our PCCs is sending a letter of protest over something the church has done, which I don't agree with. And so actually, I can't speak with one voice in that context because I completely disagree with what they're saying. And in the same way, I can't agree with one voice about the gender and sexuality issues because I have very firm opinions on one side of the debate. So, I feel that paradox within me that I'm so desperate for the church to be salt and light, yet within the church, there's loads of things we can't speak with one voice on. So it's just really complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, perhaps I'll give up and go back to bed.
Well, there we are. There's no answer to that. But yeah, salt and light. That's what we need. I've got the lights. Must have a packet of salt from McDonald's or somewhere on my table, which will come out of a pocket. I'm not quite sure. From Cafe Number One or somewhere. I must have a little packet of salt. I usually pick up more than I need, which is probably why they've started rationing out the sugar. You can't get sugar now. You have to ask them for it.
But because you've stolen too much.
Well, I don't use sugar, as you know, because I'm slim and in good shape. So I've never taken sugar for 40 years. So there we are. But not me, but other bad people have obviously taken far too much. I just concentrate on the salt and pepper. Because salt is good to spread the word, obviously.
Good. Well, you can find us salty people, salt and lighty people, all over social media, endeavouring to be salt and light on TikTok.
Peppered all over.
On TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and everywhere else you can find us. And do go and look us up. If you find us on Facebook, go and click our links on YouTube. You'll find other things there. If you find us on YouTube, go and look for our websites. There's always more information to find out about what's going on and what we're doing.
There is.
We'll see you again next week.
You will.
Bye.